So now that vCenter has been installed on our server, let's take a look. So if we go on to the Start menu, if you go into All Programs, go to VMware, is that there's a lot of vCenter related things listed here. None of these will actually give you an interface. So what we're going to do is we're just going to use our regular VMware vSphere client to connect to vCenter, just as we did when we connected directly to hosts. That's going to be slightly different because we're going to be logging into a Windows service rather than directly into the host as root or some other Unix user account. Just choose the VMware vSphere client. It's the exact same client. I had it installed before I installed vCenter. If I didn't have it installed, I wouldn't even be able to do any of this, and I'd have to run through the installation for it. So you can see it remembers that previously I was connecting to my host. In this case, I'm now going to connect to vCenter. Instead of using 225, I'm going to use 175. And once again, instead of using root, I'm going to use administrator. In fact, since I'm already logged into this box as administrator with the right password, I can just say use my Windows session credentials and log me in as me. And this is one of the nice things about using a Windows service. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that and click login. And now we're getting the same sort of things that we had when we connected directly to the host. We have a self-signed SSL certificate. We're going to get a warning for that. That's okay. I'm just going to say, don't warn me about this anymore and ignore it. Once all that's done, we're going to get the normal vSphere client interface that we've come to expect. The difference is that there's not really going to be anything in it, because what we need to do is we need to put our hosts under management by vCenter. So we're going to actually have to create that association and add those hosts. Kind of have a getting started page here and says you're going to need to create a data center, you're going to need to add a host, then you're going to need to add a virtual machine. We don't actually need to do that. Once I add the host, all the virtual machines that go with it will just appear. But I could start creating additional virtual machines. Or of course, vCenter is probably one of the earlier things that I install, so I may not have any real virtual machines yet on my hosts. But if I do, those will come over. Personally, I don't really need this getting started page anymore. I'm going to just go ahead and say close tab for that and get rid of it. If we go over to the left-hand side, we can see that we have vc01.vmwarelab.local. If you're in this interface. Now, depending on what you've done with this client, if you've never installed the client before, you might not end up in the inventory interface by default. There's a good chance you're going to end up on the home page. Now, if you remember the home that we had when we were connected to a host, things are slightly different. We had far fewer options. We had search and we had hosts and clusters, and we had roles and system logs. That's about it. I mean, we didn't have much more than that. And as you can see here, we have quite a bit more. Hosts and clusters, VMs and templates, data stores and data clusters, networking. A lot of these things, of course, we can already access through the host. For example, networking, I can already, even without vCenter, go to the host and access its networking features. But being able to access the networking features directly makes it easier when I have many hosts. We'll take a little bit more of a tour of this a little bit later. For now, let's take a look at adding a host. If I open the inventory menu, you'll see you can't really do much from here at this point. If you go over to the view, you'll notice that you do have another inventory section, and then you can switch over to hosts and clusters. I'm just going to, from the shortcut here, click hosts and clusters. Now that I'm in the inventory hosts and clusters view, the first thing I'm going to need to do is create a data center before I can add a host. So what I'm going to do is right click on VC01 and choose new data center. Now, this doesn't really do very much. We have to have at least one data center. We can have multiple data centers, or we could have everything in one large data center. There are certain restrictions. For example, hosts in the same cluster have to be in the same data center, and so on. We could just create one data center for our whole environment, but there are also permissions and things that go with it. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a data center and call it Lab Environment 1. So we now have a data center, which doesn't really mean much of anything. It's a virtual object inside VMware that we can use to group hosts. Now that might sound a lot like a cluster, but we're not at clustering yet. And depending on the version of VMware that you have, you may not be able to support clustering at all, even though you still have vCenter. Data centers do organize groups of servers or groups of clusters potentially as well. So now that I have a data center, I'm going to go ahead and add a host by right-clicking the data center and saying Add Host, and then providing the details of the host that I want to connect to. I'm going to go ahead and tell it to connect to 10.82.1.151 is my ESXi node 1 effectively. And here I'm going to specify root, and I'm going to specify the password for root. Now, this only gets used when we're adding the host. So this root account is not used all of the time. If I change the password for this root account, for example, I don't have to do anything to vCenter. What's actually going to happen when I click next is it's going to connect to that host. It's going to log in as root. It's going to install the VPXD service for the virtual center agent effectively, and also create a VPX user that's going to be used by this and set a random password on it. So in this case, I'm just going to leave it at root. Click next. And once again, it gives us a warning. I'll just say yes. And you can see that it does detect that I've got a few virtual machines running there. And I'm going to go ahead and click next. If I had any license keys to assign, I could assign them from here. I'm just going to go ahead and click next. We also have something called lockdown mode. So now that we're using vCenter to manage this host, we shouldn't really be connecting directly to the host using the Vsphere client, because of course we're going to be bypassing whatever vCenter would want to do typically. So lockdown mode will prevent that, and we could still go on the console and we can still connect through vCenter, but we can't log directly in using the client to that host. This sounds like a good idea, but if your vCenter is virtualized, which is fully supported, and it's sitting on these hosts, then sometimes we might need to connect to those hosts in order to be able to start up the vCenter virtual machine, for example, if it's not running. So in those cases, probably better not to do that. For now, I'm just going to leave that as is and click next. And that gives me the option to specify where my virtual machines will go if I had clusters in that data center. I don't have any of that yet. So as you can see, it's all fairly simple. So you can see we have a little bit of a task down at the bottom running to add the standalone host. We can watch the progress of that. If I expand my lab environment data center, we can see that it is in the process of adding that host, but it's currently in an error state while it's waiting for everything to respond. We do still show a warning on the server, and when I added it, it probably would have been better to use a DNS name than an IP address. And I have registered them all in DNS, but I just used the IP in this case. When I go to click on it, you'll see on the summary page, it's actually just warning us that the ESXi shell has been enabled, which is actually the same warning we get when we connect to that host directly. So from this point, it's really not very different from what we had seen in using the Vsphere client to connect directly to a host. As you can see, the tabs are the same. We have a couple of extra tabs here, I think, like storage views and maps. Of course, we do have other new features that we didn't have previously, such as host profiles. We also have resource pools and vApps and a couple of other things that we'll talk about in other videos. So in our next video, we're going to take a little tour through the vCenter interface, but this gives you a pretty good idea of how to get your first host registered with vCenter, and then we can continue to add additional hosts later. We'll also take a look at permissions in other videos, performance, event management, alarms, and all the various other features of vCenter.